This episode of Warp 5 is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 150,000 titles for your smartphone, tablet, or desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. Also, help us keep Star Trek discussion coming to you each day by becoming a Trek FM patron through Patreon. Get access to exclusive content and become part of the team. You'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. That's patreon.com/trekfm.
Hi, this is Dayton Ward, author of a whole bunch of Star Trek novels, and you're listening to Warp 5 on Trek FM.
How we doing, Trip? Ready when you are. Prepare for warp.
Course laid in, sir. Request permission to get underway. Let's go.
Welcome, Boomers, to another episode of Warp 5, Trek FM's dedicated Enterprise podcast. I'm your host, but I'm not Floyd. I'm Brandon. Floyd is away today. He got called on an emergency Section 31 mission. But have no fear, we've got a fun interview today. We've got Mike Sussman joining us, who is a writer and a executive story editor and a producer on Star Trek Enterprise, and he worked on Star Trek Voyager as well. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing great, Brandon. Thanks for having me on the pod.
Yeah, we're very thrilled to have you on. You've written some really good stuff. You've done a lot of work with Phyllis Strong, who we had on a couple of months ago, and so we got her side of all the juicy stories. So, are you ready to go to bat and defend yourself?
Oh yeah, I wouldn't believe anything Phyllis told you. No, Phyllis is wonderful, and we had a great time for many years working on Star Trek.
Going back as a Star Trek fan, do you remember the first episode of Star Trek you ever watched?
Wow, I don't. I don't remember which episode. Honestly, I can't even tell you which series it was. And again, this will totally date me. But I mean, I have recollections of watching the animated series and the original series, kind of discovering them both around the same time, which I guess would have been, you'd probably know this, I don't know, maybe 73? Is that when the animated series started?
Yeah.
Somewhere in that area. So, I was like 5 or 6. And I remember being really, really young and discovering this, mind-blowing television show that existed as a cartoon on Saturdays and was running every day of the week on the local, in local syndication, I guess at the time I was probably living in Philadelphia, and I was watching Star Trek, 6 days a week as a 5-year-old and thinking this was the coolest thing ever. And they were just somehow continually churning out new episodes. And how amazing is it to live in a universe where you get 6 new episodes of Star Trek every week? Of course, ultimately, I discovered the concept of the rerun, and became a little more aware, as still a kid, the realities of television production, and then that Star Trek had actually gone off the air, but no longer, being produced. I honestly I can't remember, but I do recall episodes that I would watch. Well, I mean, who am I kidding? I mean, even if And the Children shall lead came on, I would, sit down for the full hour and watch that, commercials and all, long before the days of, DVRs or VCRs even. But I, certainly had my favorites, Balance of Terror, Doomsday Machine, probably, any original series fans, top 10 list would correlate pretty closely with mine. Those are the episodes, of course, that still stand out in my memory, having seen them so many times later, ultimately on, VHS cassette tape. Again, a concept your listeners may or may not be familiar with. I can't really recall which episode it would have been. I was too young, I think, to recall.
I remember the first original episode that I sat down and watched the whole way through was Shore Leave. That was the first one that I saw.
Oh yeah, that must have been a mind blower. How old were you at the time?
I was in my teens at the time. I discovered Star Trek when I was about 12 or 13. Now, I remember my mom had sat us down to watch Encounter at Farpoint when it aired, and I would have been, 5 years old when that happened. And I remember asking her when it was airing, like, is that supposed to be Spock? Is that supposed to be Kirk? So somehow at that time I had some kind of knowledge of the characters of it, but throughout the years I'd caught a few episodes here and there. I remember I saw during reruns one summer when I was out in British Columbia visiting my dad, I saw a trailer for Identity Crisis, which is a season 4 episodes of The Next Generation where Geordi turns into that invisible alien thing. And
sure.
For some reason, I'm like, I gotta watch this episode. This looks so cool. And it was still another year or two before I really caught the Star Trek bug. But I remember seeing that trailer for Identity Crisis and like, I gotta watch this show.
No, I mean, I caught it pretty early. There was just nothing like it on television, certainly at the time, and certainly not a lot of genre stuff. And I gravitated toward it right away. So it was, a formative influence, I think, on my youth and my adulthood.
Right on. Well, we're going to actually open up some of these questions here. Before we jump into your Star Trek work here, I do have a couple of your shows that I do want to talk about, and we're going to actually open up with a listener question here. So Dan Leckie says, for the episode 100 Years of 12 Monkeys, he says, I was wondering about the episode's development. Was it fun to write the 1940s material, and did you include any in-jokes when you wrote the episode?
Wow, 12 Monkeys. Yeah, that was a show I worked on a couple years ago with my friend Terry Metalis, who got his start on Star Trek Enterprise and had written a couple of episodes. He had been Bram Braga's assistant and was just, a baby writer, an aspiring writer when we first worked together. And now he's got his own TV show with 12 Monkeys, which I think was recently renewed for another season. So no, that episode was a lot of fun. I came in season 2, and that episode, 100 Years, was a little bit of not quite a reboot for the series, but setting the series off in a new direction. Correct me if I'm wrong, but at that point in time, the show, in terms of the time travel, had jumped back and forth between like the present day and 20 some years in the future after the plague had wiped out humanity. And one of the the goals for the new season was to open up the time travel aspect and visit other eras. And one of the first eras that came up was the 40s, World War II, the pre-war hysteria, and it was great fun to write that episode. And I do remember, there's a teaser that just starts in the 40s, and when two of the basically these assassins from the future show up and murder this military hero and his wife, and then take their place in order to do their carry out their evil plan and take the place of these two people at a gala. And anyway, it was a whole lot of fun showing their arrival, figuring out how they would get there, what their time travel plot was, and coming up with a really interesting way for Cassie. She's actually this was, I think, the first time. Well, she had time traveled before, but she was traveling back before Cole was, and was going to arrive in the 40s before he did. So I remember brainstorming with everyone, trying to come up with a cool entrance for her into the 1940s. And what we ended up doing was have her basically wrong franchise, excuse me. She materializes on Broadway, like on a Saturday night, in the middle of all these well-dressed theater goers who are going to a show, when suddenly an air raid siren sounds and spotlights shine on the sky looking for planes, and everybody evacuates, and she's sort of left alone in the middle of Broadway as the air sirens wail, which of course we didn't have we weren't shooting, on Broadway in New York City at all, but the production team, I thought, did like an amazing job bringing that theater to life and dressing it and, bringing everyone in period costumes and adding the special effects component. It was a great, I thought, introduction for that era. And we spent a couple episodes in the 40s, and I think we certainly went back to the 50s that season, and they may have come back since. I've sort of lost track of the show. I've been busy with some other things, but it was fun to do that big reset and sort of launch the show into this new era. And I'm really enjoying it.
TV has changed so drastically over the last 20 years from what it used to be, and I don't know, a lot of people credit Star Trek with that. I personally would credit like The Sopranos and like early HBO shows with the transition of television and how it's kind of turned into what it is now with these season-long arcs that are basically a book in a series, right? So you got like Sopranos was basically a 6-book television show, right? So it's changed, and the flexibility and the creativity that television provides people with nowadays, I think, exceeds what's on the big screen in many, many ways.
Sure. I mean, it certainly gives you a canvas where you can spend a lot more time and with a character or a group of characters and get to know them in a way that you just can't in a 2-hour movie where I love a big, exciting, comic book film like, Civil War as much as the next person, but there's only a certain amount of time you can devote to, getting to know them as people. And, I think in television in many ways, because of shows like The Sopranos and Breaking Bad, it's almost become a brand new art form. Again, no one, you have to, it might take a long time to find someone who's like a bigger fan of Star Trek than me, like just growing up as a kid. But, I think even the later series, the sequel series, as terrific as they were very much kind of a throwback to the format of the original show. Granted, Deep Space Nine and even Enterprise and some of the other series did experiment with, season-long arcs, but I think there was still, pretty much, a directive to keep things as wrapped up as tightly as you could in 2 hours. I do remember working as a freelancer, working on Star Trek Voyager, and there was an episode that I had written, or I'd written a story for. I believe it was Mel, the one with Brad Dourif as a serial killer, and there was a serialized thread that season that I remember the writers were experimenting with. And again, I was not even on the staff of the show. I was just a freelancer. I was a former intern who had told them some stories. And there was an ongoing storyline about Paris, the character of Tom Paris, and how he appeared to be betraying the crew, that they were trying to set up this thread. And ultimately it was
right.
going to be a bit of a red herring, and they were going to surprise everybody. But they were setting up Tom Paris as basically a traitor, and there was a lot of concern. I remember, and again, I'm a freelance writer sitting in the room, and the writers are incorporating the serialized element into the show. There was a lot of concern that people watching these episodes out of order were going to be somewhat confused, that these I think there were only like 2 scenes related to that arc. We're just going to confuse people. And honestly, I think it kind of did. I think those 2 scenes kind of, they really jumped out and didn't really fit, with that episode. But, I think that, one of the challenges, any new Star Trek series is going to face is that balance of serialization and, standalone. Obviously you can just do a 10 episode or 13 or 15 episode Star Trek movie that is, 15 hours long. But, the Star Trek that I wrote, that I remember, that the audience remembers, often had was wrapped up in a bow at the end of, an hour. And I think it's a great creative challenge to find out, does that still work in this era of peak television? I imagine it doesn't. I imagine Star Trek, like anything else, is going to have to, continue to evolve. Yeah, sure. But I think your point is absolutely right. I think, Star Trek is really, very much a creature of the 60s. And, I think that kind of, was one of the factors with Enterprise, and that Enterprise was trying to evolve into this new era. I mean, we were concurrent with, some of these other shows, and yet the format of the show was a very familiar, formula that had worked very successfully for a long time. But audiences, I think, were changing, and tastes were changing, and I think television is still trying to, get caught up, and the people creating television are still trying to figure out, what works. And how do you take something like Star Trek, which is known for, being one type of format, and how do you, reinvent it for the new era? It was certainly reinvented, brilliantly by, Gene Roddenberry and Rick Berman, and ultimately, Michael Piller came in the late 80s and early 90s. But we're in a sort of similar, I think, new era now, where television has changed even more than it changed, say, between the 60s and the 80s.
Now, you had mentioned the episode Meld. That was the first episode that you'd worked on for Star Trek Voyager. Now, your credit on that was story by, right?
Yeah, that was, I had done I was an intern with the writing staff of Voyager for, I believe it was 6 weeks. And on the last day of my internship, I pitched a story to Michael Piller, who, was the co-creator of Voyager and showrunner at the time. And I pitched him a story about a serial killer that was, loose on the ship. And I remember very distinctly him, kind of taking a moment and staring at the ceiling. And I was so sure this was the end of my involvement with Star Trek. It was the last day of my internship, and clearly I had blown it. But he then looked down and he looked at me and he said, "I've never heard a story like that before." And the following Monday, this was a Friday, the following Monday, I came back to the offices as a freelance but working writer with a pitch that had sold to Star Trek. So it was a very exciting time for me. Michael ended up writing. I got story credit for it. Michael ended up doing a lot of revisions to that story, and he did the teleplay. Ultimately, I think at the time, and again, this is back in the era of Star Trek series making 26 episodes a season. They were really under the gun at that particular moment and needed a script very quickly and needed a cheap one. And it made more sense for Michael to simply take my idea and just write it, rather than give it to a newcomer like me who had never written a professional script before. But it was my first sale, and it opened the door for me on Voyager, and eventually sold some other episodes. And but it was a great beginning, and I'm really happy that I got a chance to work with Michael towards the end of his involvement with Star Trek. It meant a great deal to me, having been a fan of his work on the show for so long.
Mm-hmm. Now, like, that episode in itself is an extremely fascinating one, because every time I watch it, it surprises me, because, you get a common trope in television of, the murder mystery, and he solves the case by the end of the episode. But in this one, he solves the case by the end of the first act, and it turns into this psychological drama and this battle of the wills between logic and violence. And it's a really, really fascinating script. And so how much of that was your original idea, and how much of that came from Michael Piller?
Well, Michael had pitched out, again, I was an intern, and one of my responsibilities as the intern was to, sit in on all the writers' meetings and take notes and write, the showrunner, whether it was Michael or Jerry Taylor was there, would pitch out the beats and the scenes for the episode, and I, as the intern, would write them in marker on the dry erase board. And so I was there for a lot of meetings with the writing staff. And what I remember very early on hearing is that, often you'll have a showrunner say to his or her writing staff, well, I'd like to do an episode about X. I don't know what X is, or what, maybe X is just a theme, or I want to do a story where, Captain Janeway, falls in love. Does anybody have any ideas for that kind of an episode? Well, what Michael had pitched was he wanted to do a story. Really, all what he had was a theme, and he wanted to do an episode about Tuvok and senseless violence. And he had wanted to do this for several months. And I think some of the other writers perhaps had given him some pitches for ideas that didn't quite work for Michael. But he really wanted to explore that theme, the notion of this, very logical security officer, this Vulcan, who, we've gotten another species through, all these different series, how they would confront something like senseless violence. And so I was racking my brain for weeks because I felt like if I could come up with an idea that had that theme, Michael might buy it, and I could kick off my writing career. I had several really awful takes on it. I think at one point I had come up with something about, the Voyager running into, gangs in space, or, I was really coming up with things that were too on the nose. And then I remember I just kind of gave up on it. And at one point I think I was falling asleep, and my mind was wandering in that sort of in between state between being asleep and being awake. And I just had this image of Tuvok mind melding with this sort of like a reptilian killer, and being affected and influenced because of the incompatibilities of the reptilian brain and the Vulcan brain. And I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what it meant, but I remember waking up from this half asleep state and writing it down on a notepad. And then I took my nap, and later finding it, I thought that was like a very cool genesis for this kind of story. So I wrote it up as a pitch and pitched it to Michael, and he ran with it. So that was the genesis of Meld. And they ended up bringing back that character, I think, for the season ender.
That's right.
The Brad Dourif killer character. And I think didn't he and the Doctor save the ship when the Kazon took it over?
Yes, he did. Yep.
Yeah. So that was it was great fun to see that come to life. I wish it was a script I could have had more of a hand in, but again, this is what often happens in television. You are just under the gun and you need a script, ready for production, ready to shoot. And clearly Michael knew it. Once he'd heard the idea and it clicked with this theme that he wanted to explore, he was the perfect person, clearly to write it. It would have taken me weeks and weeks and weeks, I'm sure, to get it even anywhere in the ballpark. But they were, Michael and Jerry and everybody was certainly, very lovely to me, and invited me back many, many more times to pitch future stories, which I did, some of which they bought. So it ended up working out very nicely. I'm very proud of that.
So how did you meet Phyllis Strong, and how did you begin writing so much with her?
Oh, well, Phyllis and I were friends from like the mid-90s. In fact, we had worked on a show very briefly. It was a show that never actually aired in the United States, based on some old short stories of Jack London. And we were put together with this, it was a very, very small writing staff. They were trying to figure out the show, and Phyllis and I were thrown together, if I remember, in a conference room because they didn't have enough offices for everybody. And so we even though we had been hired individually as story editors on the show, because we were sharing this, big conference room office, people would just kind of come in. The producer would come in with, ideas or problems to solve, and we would just kind of work on them together. So we kind of became like this de facto writing team. And then years later, when Voyager was looking for some new writers, I think they were, very understandably looking for more diversity in the writing staff, and I recommended Phyllis, and who they had not worked with before. But then the idea came up very quickly that, would Phyllis and I be interested in working together on this? And we both jumped at the chance. So, and since we'd already functioned as a writing team on that previous job, we were certainly comfortable working together, and we were both crazy fans of the whole franchise. So it worked out terrifically, and we wrote together on Star Trek for 3 years before branching off and running with it as individual writers.
Mm-hmm. Now, you guys together wrote my personal favorite episode of Enterprise, which is Future Tense. I really love that episode a lot. Yeah, so I was wondering, I asked Phyllis this, and she couldn't recall, but I'm wondering if you happen to know, did you write a backstory for this person that they found in the ship?
Oh, I knew who I wanted. Well, yes, there was a version of the story where, you remember the character of Crewman Daniels?
Yep.
Right, who is a time traveler from the 31st century, I want to say. Anyway, my pitch, I think to Brannon, was that at the end of the episode, Crewman Daniels would sort of, materialize and time travel to the bridge of Archer's ship and say, oh, that, after, there's a big battle with the Tholians, it's all very exciting. And if you remember, the, Trip is building a sort of time communicator, sending out a distress call to who knows where to come and get the ship before the Tholians make off with it. So in the current script, that ship just sort of disappears. But my version of the story, Crewman Daniels was going to show up and take the ship back, and Archer's going to ask him, by the way, whose body is that? And he's going to say, well, actually, it's mine.
Wow. And
then he disappears, and we get no more answers. And I don't know why that was rejected. Maybe it's a dumb idea, but I think that the decision was made at a higher level to keep it more mysterious, and I think that worked as well. But that's who I thought it might be. I thought it was either Daniels or another sort of Daniels like time traveler. But there was something I thought fun about a time traveler, showing up to pick up his own dead body. That would have been a cool thing to reveal, but I guess we'll never know.
I like that. That's pretty cool. I've said numerous times on the show, like, why I love that episode so much and why it's my favorite, and it's because there's so many things in it. To me, it's the first perfect prequel episode of the series because there's so many elements in it that as soon as you see them or hear them, it instantly brings up memories of other Star Trek shows. Like when Archer asks the episode, could this be Zephram Cochrane? Bang, immediately, Metamorphosis is in my mind. The Tholians come on the screen. Bang, instantly, the Tholian web is in my mind, Like, there's so many elements in it that immediately make you think of the original Star Trek series. And I think that's one of the great things about this episode.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I mean, the original pitch, which I think in many ways was unworkable, was even more of a throwback. And anyone has checked this out on the Memory Alpha Wiki, it's more or less public knowledge. But the ship from the future that originally showed up in my first pitch was the Starship Defiant from the Tholian Web. And that there were going to be, forces, vying to get the ship and take it back to, whatever time period it was from. That pitch was deemed, problematic. One, we'd have to, build the Defiant, which nobody was prepared to do. Plus, it also really would kind of screw up the timeline in a way. If Archer and his crew were to see a Federation starship, it would really open a can of worms. So, obviously, I saved that idea, and later I ended up doing a different version of it. But that was the original take on that notion.
Okay, that's interesting that you've been holding on to that idea for a while because it works so well in a Mirror Darkly that it was we get into the Tholian space, we get it into the parallel universe, and again, that episode right there takes a whole bunch of elements from the original series and plays with them. And In a Mirror Darkly, I don't know if you're aware of this, I'm sure you are, is quite often hailed as the best episode of Enterprise by fans.
Oh, that's very nice to hear. I know it was so much fun to make, and I was glad ultimately that the original take on that was rejected, because then we got future tense out of it, and then we got the 2-part Mirror Universe show all those years later. Plus, in making it the Mirror Universe, we were able to have, the evil doppelganger of, Archer and everybody else explore those ships and live in the uniforms and learn everything they could. Whereas had there been a version of Future Tense where that was the Defiant, I don't know how much of that we could have realistically done without really upending the premise of the series. Unless everybody took, amnesia pills at the end of the episode. Not sure how that would have worked, but yeah, basically we ended up getting 3 episodes out of that one idea. So it all worked out in the end.
Now on In a Mirror Darkly as well, you got your acting debut. How did you channel your inner dead crewman?
Yeah, it's harder than you think to lie still on the floor and not really breathing while Scott Bakula and a couple of stuntmen are walking around you. No, that was I think Mary Howard, who was our line producer, and who worked on all of the series. I remember at the production meeting asked me if I wanted to play a dead crewman, and yes was my immediate answer. And I was lucky enough to get an actual red shirt. It was one of the red shirts that. It was the red shirt, believe it or not, that David Gerald had worn during his cameo in More Troubles on Deep Space Nine. They kept all those uniforms, and they simply changed out the insignia patches. They made a new Defiant insignia patch for that episode. And David's name was on the back of the uniform, and the boots had also been used in that episode, and they were Avery Brooks. They were Avery Brooks boots from Trials and Tribulations. So I felt like I was walking in Star Trek history in so many more ways than one. Although later on, I actually, believe it or not, I'm 2 dead crewmen in that episode. I actually played 2 dead red shirts, although I cut out the appearance where I was face up because the scene was just running too long. It was just too much footage of Scott and stuntmen wandering around the empty ship. And so I think you can see my butt in the current cut, and that's it. So much for my great cameo.
Now, one of the interesting things about Season 4 of Enterprise is we got a lot of multi-episode arcs. 3-episode arcs was, we had, I think, about 3 of them in the season, which is an extremely interesting new way to tell stories in the Star Trek universe. Now, you wrote Kirshara, which was the 3rd episode in an arc. So how is the process different from writing not the whole arc, but just a part of it? Do you work closely with the other 2, or were the other 2 episodes written and then handed to you, and it's like, okay, now you got to finish it?
It was kind of the process all happened, pretty much at once. Not that all the scripts were being written at once, but, like part 2, for instance, I remember there was a character I remember I needed for Kirshara when, forgive me for, I can't really recall a lot of the names of the Vulcan characters in that episode. But I realized when I was breaking the story that we needed somebody to stand up to, I think his name was Vlas, the bad guy, the leader of the High Command, and that we would basically need a Vulcan character to stand up to him and take control. So I remember, going, I can't remember, I think I went to Manny Cotto, who, was the showrunner for Season 4 and very involved in the breaking of those particular stories. And asking to, can we get this character? Because I think I really need it for part 3 for someone to sort of lead the revolution. It wasn't like a big part, but it was a necessary part. So that character ended up getting inserted in, I think in episode 2. or the prior episode in that arc to set him up. So I mean, there's a lot of push and pull things that if I, like I said, if I needed to set something up, if I needed something that I wanted to, have paid off, that needed to be set up earlier, often there were things in earlier episodes that I would now have to, pay off, even though I didn't write the original setup. But I mean, for me, that episode was, so much fun to work on, because I got to, figure out what this whole 3 arc was kind of a big reset in many ways for, the Vulcans and their relationship with Earth. And so it was really great to be the one that kind of, swoop in at the end there and tie up all of those ends that, obviously there was a story of, Surak and his Katra, and, and there was a resolution also to Paul's marriage and where that was going. And I had a little pet idea that I had hoped to insert, that I pitched as being part of one of the earlier episodes in the arc, that there was no time for. Everyone kind of liked my idea, and it was kind of a big idea, was that it was ultimately the Romulans that were behind this ruler on Vulcan, who was pushing his planet in a more militaristic direction. By the way, if this sounds at all close to anything that's going on in the world right now, purely coincidental. So I had hoped that we could set up the Romulans in an earlier way, and that we would establish some Romulan characters behind the scenes, pulling the strings. We'd see that Bloss was his puppet, and that they were really involved in an effort, not necessarily, on the one hand, Starfleet would see it as nefarious, but that they were really interested in Vulcan reunification with Romulus, which clearly is, something that goes back to the next generation, or something that goes forward to the next generation, depending on your perspective. So I really wanted to set that up, but those stories were already so cram-packed with character and plot and incident and really great stuff. There was just no time for it. And I got to the end of the writing process, and I realized, maybe there's a way to just sort of drop that notion in and reveal at the end that the Romulans were perhaps behind this entire thing all along, and then leave it as kind of a tantalizing mystery. And so I ended up, writing that final scene, because honestly, even without that, you take that final scene away, I didn't quite know. The episode kind of ended with a very happy bow on the end. It was just a little too neat and clean, but there was something really wonderful about, revealing this Romulan operative, revealing this character who we've already seen before, who, is now in full Romulan regalia and pulling strings. And what we had hoped to initially do, Manny and I can't remember which one of us had pitched it, but what we wanted to be the last image of that Vulcan arc, the last image in Kirshara, was going to be a Romulan bird of prey, which we'd already seen on the series in season 2. Yeah. We'd seen that wonderful new design, and the idea was that ship would sort of swoop up in front of the camera, and we would see, painted on the hull, that familiar bird of prey imagery, which had not been established earlier on the show. The first time we saw those ships, so that was the original image. And that ship would, of course, have been, picking up the Romulan operative on the surface. Ultimately, there was no time, there was no money. It was kind of beside the point. But I felt like I got a little bit of a victory by having that final scene and reveal this tie-in to much deeper, Star Trek mythology and the Romulans and Vulcans, and how that, and establishing that the Romulans have been up to this reunification plot of theirs for a very, very long time. That was a lot of fun.
My last question that I have for you before we go into the listener questions is about the episode Twilight. Now, we had recently covered Twilight in our Season 3 retrospective, and it generated some discussion online because, now I haven't listened to your commentary for the episode, but some of the listeners said they had. We weren't quite sure of the relationship that was implied with T'Pol and Archer. Now, this was a different timeline. This was prior to any solidifying of any relationship between Trip and T'Pol, because that timeline hadn't quite happened yet. So we're wondering, what was your intentions for the relationship between Archer and T'Pol?
Well, I think I think there's certainly room for speculation about what may or may not have happened off camera. But I mean, certainly in the episode, what's, more than hinted at pretty strongly is that in all of their years together on this planet, where Archer's memory keeps getting wiped every time he falls asleep, and each day is a new day. By the way, I want to point out 50 First Dates came out after this episode. So
we named that episode when we talked about it. We called it 50 First Dates. Had that movie come out first and I'd seen it, I probably would have dismissed the concept of Twilight. But so in my defense, that was after. But I think it's pretty clear that she fell in love with Archer in a very subtle Vulcan like way, whereas for him, no time was passing, and each day was as the day before, and that she simply started to have feelings for him, and that's more or less in the episode where Phlox. I think there's a really great scene that Phlox and Paul had where he kind of calls her on it, because she decides that she's going to accompany Archer back to Earth or Vulcan, and Phlox can, as he often can kind of see right through her and say, "You have feelings for him, don't you?" And she completely denies it, as she would. But I think what you're asking is, did T'Pol and Archer have a more physical or romantic relationship prior to the start of the episode in that 12-year period? And I guess my answer to that would be, I don't think so. It would seem a little odd for, I think, T'Pol of all people to, perhaps take advantage of someone with a mental condition who couldn't remember. Also, I think it would be totally out of character for Archer, since his mindset had not really changed from, he was not really advancing the 12 years that she was. He was just reliving, time over and over again. That he would not have gone there. But there is a lot of dialogue or an exchange between the two of them where she implies very strongly to Archer that their relationship has evolved. If I remember, it was a word that was used, evolved over the years. And he asks, "Oh, really? How far has it evolved?" And she kind of gives him a look. Well, right.
The original draft of the script, she actually gave him an answer. And her answer was, "It hasn't evolved that far." And I remember we got a note from Scott Bakula, saying, "Could we just lose that last line? It kind of makes Archer seem a little more cool if maybe, he and T'Pol have, gone where no man has gone before." So, and I think he was absolutely right. The scene works better without that line. But I think the implications there, kept some people wondering. In my mind, nothing happened, but I think it was fun to suggest that maybe something did.
It also leaves it open for the fans, because there's so many people who like to, the term is shipping. They like to relationship people, and so it leaves it open for people. Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, that was the season where we were kind of, we were given the directive that Trip and T'Pol were going to become a thing. And I had this episode where T'Pol fell in love with Archer, and which fell a little, out of step with that. In fact, in Twilight, what I thought was kind of interesting is that, T'Pol and Trip really did not like each other. I think, on some level, Trip may have subconsciously blamed her for, Archer being incapacitated and ultimately what happened to Earth. And they really hate each other, which I thought was a great counterpoint to, where they ended up as a couple. And they were great fun to write in, later on in season 3 and season 4, when they were together and not together and then together again. So a couple listener questions that we have. So this is from Justin Ozer, and he says, how was writing for Voyager a different experience than writing for Enterprise, and how are they similar?
Wow. It's a real good question. I think with, Enterprise, I was there, at the very beginning. I mean, when we got the script for the pilot, which, I think Broken Bow, still stands far and away as, probably the very best Star Trek pilot. But at the time, nobody, and I remember reading that script, and I was just wrapping up on Voyager, and being blown away by the writing and the concept and where it was going, and that it was a prequel show, and about a ship called the Enterprise again, which was great. And so, to me, the potential for that show to, become like the sort of first prequel series in the Star Trek mythos was very exciting. And I was coming in at the ground floor, whereas with Voyager, even though I had sold some stories early on in season 2, I didn't really go on staff on the show until season 7. And by that point, there were a lot of new writers there, and they had already explored, so many different directions and arcs for, Captain Janeway and her crew. But now we had a brand new crew. And although there were certainly, a lot of ideas in place about, who everybody was and where we wanted to take those characters, it was great fun to be there at the beginning. And having worked on other shows where you're there at the beginning, or where you kind of come in later and have to get up to speed and figure out where these, what has already been done with these characters, where can we take them in a new direction that the audience hasn't already seen. It's much more fun, I feel, as a writer, to come in at that ground floor and imagine who these people are, from the beginning. You're discovering them along with the audience, and launching them into brand new adventures that that are new to their character. That a member of the audience is going to say, oh well, in episode 47 of season 3, they already did something like this. Why is Hoshi scared of aliens all over again? And taking characters and sort of regressing them, making them not less professional, but just the concept of exploring was going to be brand new. It was that whole, right stuff notion, the first explorers out there in the galaxy, and this, one of the very first ships. That was very exciting and invigorating. And I felt was a great way to tell Star Trek stories, but tell them with characters who have a very fresh perspective that is much closer to the audiences, and show them, have characters like Hoshi who are truly afraid of the dark and afraid of the unknown. And, as inspiring as it was to, someone like myself as a viewer watching, Captain Kirk, Spock, or Captain Picard have a very, rational, view of the unknown, and, and be very calm and cool and collected about dealing with it. There was something a lot of fun about, writing characters who had not yet, developed that sort of veneer of, professionalness, and where the unknown was still very scary to them.
Listener Janet Lee asks, what are your thoughts on the diversity of the Vulcan personalities? And I think her intention behind the question is how the Vulcan personalities seem to be so different at the start of Enterprise versus how we saw them later on in the Star Trek universe.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they are, quite frankly. I thought it was absolutely the right direction from Brandon and Rick to have the Vulcans play an almost adversarial role. I think for some people, flew in the face of our great love for Spock and what he did with that character and with that whole race. But you look at an episode of, say, like A Mock Time, where we go back to Vulcan, and we meet Spock's wife, who is a very manipulative and logically manipulative woman. And so I think the Vulcans are as diverse as human beings are. I think all too often, on Star Trek, a particular, often, simply for, storytelling and budgetary reasons, one character, one actor in prosthetics or makeup end up representing an entire race. And certainly, there's so much more diversity to be had. No alien species Star Trek universe, I think, has the diversity and appearance and attitudes that say even, humans do, because that we think that would be very, confusing to the audience. Or look, for instance, at the Klingons, who have, many different appearances and looks and philosophies, sometimes from television series to television series. I don't have, an explanation for the Vulcans' diverse opinions or diverse behaviors, to say, look at human beings, and there are good ones and there are not so good ones. And certainly that's true of the races in that universe.
Listener Marcia Pratt said she really enjoyed reading Age of the Empress from the Star Trek The Mirror Universe saga. Do you have any more story ideas that you'd like to write about?
Any more ideas regarding the Mirror Universe, or?
I think she just left it as vague, so any Star Trek stories at all that you'd like to maybe write in a book form again.
I actually I just wrote the story for that, and there were two other writers, and it was Dayton Ward and Kevin Dillmore, who kind of came in and really did the lion's share of work in that. I think they had taken maybe a 10-page outline that I had written and, fleshed it out into, I don't know how many pages it was ultimately. I mean, it was really, I guess, just a novella. I haven't given it a ton of thought. I don't think, it takes an incredible amount of time and energy to write prose. And I think one thing I learned in that experience is that I'm a scriptwriter, not a novelist. It was great fun to work on. If for some reason Star Trek were ever to revisit that storyline and go back to the Mirror Universe and find out what happened to Empress Hoshi, I might have some thoughts, but they probably have to be in a teleplay form.
I wonder if we'll get some Mirror Universe in Discovery or not.
Yeah, I'm not holding my breath. I'm feeling that they're going their own direction as they should, and it was great fun writing those episodes, but I think there is potentially something, a little broad about the very concept of the Mirror Universe, that, again, this gets back to, reinventing Star Trek for the modern era. I think something like, say, yesterday's Enterprise, which showed a very dark, Star Trek universe, the Federation was at war with the Klingons, is probably a more grounded way to do something like that. But who knows? Maybe.
So listener Ikaku Beeman would like to know, what piece of writing of yours are you most proud of, be it Star Trek or otherwise?
Piece of writing I'm proud of. I try not to focus too much on, things I've done before. Since it's what your audience is into, and in terms of Star Trek writing I've done, I guess it would be between the Mirror Darkly episodes and Twilight. I remember when the script for Twilight came out and it was distributed to the actors. I remember, the producers, they got a phone call from Scott, who really, really liked the script. And remember, this was at a time when, the future of Star Trek, in terms of the feature films, was very much up in the air. Can't remember if Nemesis had come out yet, but I think the hope and plan had been that if Enterprise had run 7 years and been a big success on the order of Next Gen, that perhaps someday they would do feature films. I don't think this is speaking out of turn by talking about this. Again, there were no contracts, there was nothing formalized, but I think that was sort of everybody's hope. But I remember, Scott called the writers' offices, and I think he called Rick and said, "This is a very good idea. We should hang on to this for a potential movie someday," which was really flattering to hear. Unfortunately, we needed a script to shoot that following week, and that was going to happen. But it was something that had come together, really really nicely, and not every idea does, or something that you have high hopes for ends up just kind of laying there on the page, or not really gelling when you finally see a cut of it. But that was an episode that from the get-go I was just very passionate about, and I thought it was a great way to tell a Star Trek love story, and it was very much in the tradition of, say, A City on the Edge of Forever, or An All Good Things. Star Trek had at this point done many of these sort of reset type episodes, but I thought it was still a unique enough idea that it fit in that type of episode, but was not too derivative of anything except 51st Dates, which again has not come out yet. I want to point out, but that was one that just came together really wonderfully, and I think it worked. It had a lot of time travel shenanigans in it, but it worked ultimately because it really was a love story, and it was a story of unrequited love, and how Paul had developed feelings for Archer, and imagining a scenario where that could happen seems really almost impossible, but that was an episode that I got to destroy the Earth, the planet Earth, in the teaser of the episode. How often you get to do that in Star Trek or any other television series,
right?
So it had there was a very tragic backstory, clearly, but it was really a taste of what might have been for Paul and Archer. And it was, originally that was a story that I pitched to Voyager as a Janeway and Chakotay story.
Okay.
Not involving the destruction of the Earth, but with them trapped on a planet, and I think it was Janeway who was going to have the condition. But again, by this point, there had been Memento and so many other ideas. It taken basically the same premise and turned it into comedy. It's a good thing we did the episode, when we did in 2003, because I think it would be, pretty almost laughably old, and it's had we waited a few years longer. But at the time, and even still, that was an episode that I thought really came together wonderfully on the page, and the cast and crew did a great job.
So listener Tim Cooper wanted to know if there was any other ideas for the finale floating around, and then I'd like to add to that, you'd been working on Enterprise for 4 years, and Rick Berman and Brandon Braga came up with this idea of a swan song for the series. What was your reaction at the time, and has your reaction changed over the 15 years or so since it's aired? Because it's been, I'll add to that, because it's been derived as like most Enterprise fans are extremely upset with These Are the Voyages and how it ended the series, because it's not considered a true Enterprise episode because there's so much from the Next Generation in it.
Right. Well, I know that and Brannon had pitched, I want to say 1 or 2 years before that episode, the idea of doing an episode of Enterprise, but basically doing it as an episode of Next Generation, using the holodeck to reflect back on Enterprise, which I thought was a brilliant, wonderful idea. I remember even at one point he suggested that it would be, we would take a break for an episode. And again, this wasn't designed as the finale of Enterprise. This would just be like a random episode during the run of the show. 1 week, the audience would tune in, and the opening titles would be Star Trek: The Next Generation, and we basically get a brand new episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation that was focused on Captain Archer and his crew. And at that point, we didn't know, who we could probably get. I think it was probably already, out of the, no one actually believed we would get, Patrick Stewart to come back. So, but again, this was, I believe Brandon's idea. From the get-go, which I loved, and I thought that was a terrific episode. And I know it was a terrific premise for an episode. And I think it, with the arc of season 3 and saving the Earth and stopping the Xindi, and then Manny sort of stepping up with his own ideas for season 4, there was never a place for that episode to fit. I think if we were to have done it earlier at all, it probably would have been, maybe season 2. It's also the kind of episode that I think is hard to do early in the run of a series, And clearly, even at the very end of the series, there was a big problem with it, because it was ultimately an episode of Next Generation. I think that the idea of doing that was a terrific idea, and would have been I think the episode would have been received much more positively had it just been an episode of Next Generation tucked into the middle of Enterprise's run, not at the very end. And so I think, that element, which, by the way, again, great idea for an episode, not a great idea for the series finale. I think that was just like a wrong time to do it. But I don't think, that was recognized at the point. I think they simply saw, well, this is a cool idea. We've been kind of saving the idea. We really want to do it. We need a concept for the final episode. Let's do this really great idea we've been hanging on to. And I think, I think we may have just not stopped to think, wait a minute, is this the proper way to send off Archer and his crew? And, I think it was pretty clear to, people who were working on the show, having, read the script, really enjoyed it, thought, there was a lot of, Trip dies in it, clearly, very moving death scene, and setting up the retirement of the ship and the founding of the Federation. There's a lot of great stuff in there, but I think it was probably just the wrong time to, do a Next Gen episode. And so I understand why the cast felt slighted. It wasn't intentional by any means. It was just unfortunate, I think, that the episode ended up, falling where it did in the lineup. Because I think at a different point in the show's run, it could have been a classic.
Mm-hmm. Were there any other ideas that came around, or was the original premise to be the Demons and Terra Prime two-parter, and then they tucked this one on the end, or was there any other ideas for another final episode?
Well, it's funny because we were so, as we all, when you're trying to fill out however many episodes we were doing that. So I think we did 22 in season 4.
Yeah.
We had a lot of 2 and 3-part episodes and a couple of standalones. And I think we had more ideas and more ideas for episodes than we had actual episodes. Because I know, the original notion was that Demons and Terra Prime, it was actually going to be a 3-parter. And I think it could have, and there's certainly enough story there to get it to 3 parts. And we had to wrap it up. We had to wrap it up in 2 because Rick and Brandon had expressed that they had their idea for the finale. So, which they wrote on their own, and everyone just sort of read later. So, it would have been nice to have been able to do that arc in over 3 episodes. I think, the end of Terra Prime could have served as an end to the series. Archer gives a really nice speech. To my knowledge, there were no other ideas sort of seriously being, kicked around. When we didn't find out until it was late January of 2005, that we were not coming back. So there wasn't a whole lot of time. When we were in production on the Mirror Universe shows, I think part 1. No, actually, I think that was part 2. So there wasn't a whole lot of time to. I mean, it was always in the air that this might be it, but and I think there has been a little bit of revisionist history in that. I was shocked and surprised that we were being canceled, and as I recall, everybody else was as well. It may not have been such a shock to our dwindling viewers, but I think when you work as hard as any production crew does on a television show, you set yourself up for the job and the belief that it will continue. Because how else could you get up in the morning and work for 10 or 12 hours if it was all ultimately going to be futile? I mean, every television show gets canceled ultimately. So But no, I think felt we were really firing on all cylinders in that season, and we really had found our footing. And it's, I think not a stretch to say that some of the other series, some of the sequel series also took a couple of years to find their footing. And we thought, like, great, we found ours. And then we were canceled. And, again, television is a tough business. But after having, so many consecutive years of Star Trek on the air, I think we were all, in a little bit of disbelief that it was going to go away. And of course it did, and it's coming back now, and you can't ever really truly kill Star Trek. But there were no other ideas that were really being kicked around that I was privy to anyway. We were just so busy trying to make the 22 we did get to make in that final season.
Well, thank you so very, very much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. It's been awesome listening to your stories about working on Enterprise. And I mean, it was canceled early, but I mean, I think it's coming back. And I don't think it is. There's a lot of appreciation that's been developing for Enterprise over the last few years, and it's really starting to get the fandom that it deserves. So, thank you again so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight.
It's my pleasure, Brandon.
What are some projects that you're working on right now that our listeners can be looking out for, and how can our listeners follow you on social media?
Oh, well, I just wrapped up work on a TNT show called The Last Ship from executive producer Michael Bay. I think that's airing this August on TNT, so check that out. On social media, I'm on Twitter. I think my name is _Michael Sussman. So I don't tweet a whole lot, but every now and then I do, and it's usually about Star Trek still, all these years later.
It has that hold on people.
It really does.
Well, speaking with Mike Sussman about his work on Enterprise is not the only thing we've been discussing here on the network, so take a quick listen to this clip and see what else you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm. To the journey!
So his whittling skills are so advanced that he can whittle wood into leather.
Into vegan leather, yes.
He is now Rumpelstiltskin. He is the Rumpelstiltskin of the Marquee.
Warp 5.
You think they start to like each other, and then it's more like a father-daughter kind of relationship, and then he basically becomes 50 First Dates, and she falls in love with him.
That's great. That is true.
The 602 Club.
Yeah, I mean, Christopher Lee, that's inspired to have him in that role. It really is such a good bit of casting to have him there.
Primitive Culture, a look at history and culture through Star Trek.
The key thing with Jetrel is all of these elements are exactly the same thing as the events in real life. You know, the Metron Cascade is the bomb. Rhinax is Nagasaki or Hiroshima. You know, the poisoning is analogous to radiation poisoning and all these different things. And the parallels are enormously overt with Jetrel straight away.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out these shows and find out what we're talking about in your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe. If you're an Apple user, please be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on your iPhone, your iPad, Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And while you're there, please leave us a star rating and a written review. We think we've been doing a great job on Warp 5, and if you do as well, leaving that review will help us out absolutely more than you could possibly know. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file or grab the RSS link from our website. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show or any of our other shows, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger discussion is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, that's B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and join in on all the fun. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. And if you'd like to send us a voice transmission, the comm officer has the frequency open. Just go to speakpipe.com/TrekFM, record your message, and I will add it to a future episode. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose Send to a Show and select Warp 5, and it will come right to Floyd and myself. If you'd like to help us keep all of our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more. And it's all available through our special patrons website called Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. And we really appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. Also, if you want to wear your Trek FM fandom, you can get great Trek FM themed merchandise at the Trek FM store. Thank you always to our co-associate producers, Mike Morrison, Tim Cooper, and Justin Ozer. We greatly appreciate your help in supporting our show and supporting the network at large. Well, if you want to get in touch with Floyd, I guess the best way is probably on the Babel Conference. He's going to be away for the next episode as well, but he'll be back after that. Next week, we've got some fun, so if you want to do some homework, you can watch Seven Samurai and the Magnificent Seven and the episode Marauders. Brandon Coles and Mike Schindler will be joining me to discuss those 3 films and episodes, so I hope you'll have fun with that next time. And if you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter at Brandon Matella. And you can find me on my other show here on the network, which is called Melodic Treks, which is all about the music of Star Trek. And you can find me over on the Fandom Podcast Network with my buddies Chris and Tom, where we have a show called Good Evening, an Alfred Hitchcock podcast. And that's a lot of fun, so check us out. That's also on Twitter at Good Evening Pod. So, Boomers, thank you for listening, and join us again next time for another episode of Warp 5.